The food you're stockpiling right now probably won't save you. Not because you're doing it wrong, but because nobody tells you the real problem. A long emergency doesn't stay the same. It changes shape every single week, and a pantry built for week 1 completely fails by week 8. One family learned this the hard way. 90 days without power, 2 adults, 2 kids, 8 foods, that's it. On day 89, almost at the finish line, the father opened one last can he'd been quietly saving since the very first week. He sat down and cried while he ate. Not from pain, from something else entirely. That can is number 1 on this list, but we're starting at number 8 because the order is the whole point. Number 8. Dried whole green peas. Week 1 feels manageable. That is the trap. You eat through the fridge first, deliberately, quickly, before anything spoils. Then the freezer. By day 5 or 6, you reach into the dry pantry for the first time with real intention. And you run into something nobody warned you about. Everything is beige. Canned goods, dried grains, legumes, the entire color range of long-term food storage is some version of tan, brown, or grey. And the people sitting at that table start feeling it. Not dramatically. Not all at once, but steadily. The visual sameness of every plate registers as deprivation, even when the calories are completely sufficient. It is one of the quieter ways a well-stocked pantry begins failing the people actually living from it. This is the first problem dried whole green peas solve, and it is not the problem anyone would have predicted going in. But there is a distinction here that matters more than most people realize. Whole green peas, not split peas. This is not a minor detail. Split peas dissolve into a uniform paste under heat. Useful in some contexts, but after 4 or 5 days of soft processed textures, the body and the mind start actively wanting something that pushes back, something with structure, something that requires a real bite. Whole green peas, simmered for about 40 minutes, hold their shape completely. They have a slight satisfying resistance when you eat them. On a plate that has been entirely soft and uniform for days, that small physical difference registers as genuine variety, even when the ingredients themselves haven't changed. That is not a psychological trick. It is how sensory experience works. The brain processes texture as variety independent of flavor. Change the texture, and the meal feels different even when everything else is the same. Nutritionally, whole green peas deliver complete protein when paired with any grain because their amino acid profiles fill each other's gaps. Rice and peas, corn and peas, wheat and peas, any combination covers what neither food provides alone. They are also dense in iron and dietary fiber, 2 things that matter significantly when physical demands are climbing and overall food volume is tightening. Iron supports oxygen transport during increased physical activity. Fiber supports digestive health when diet variety drops, and they're green. On a plate that is otherwise entirely brown, that single fact is not trivial. Color variety on a plate is one of the earliest signals the brain uses to assess whether a meal is adequate. Remove it consistently, and the eating experience degrades in ways that are real and measurable, even when the macros are fine. Sealed in mylar with oxygen absorbers, shelf life of 25 to 30 years. Cost, under $2 per pound at most bulk food suppliers. Week 1 was navigable, but week 2 introduced something this family had genuinely not thought to plan for. Number 7. Canned beef ravioli. Here is a problem that appears in almost no emergency food guide ever written. By week 2, the kids were done. Not hungry, done. Done with beans, done with rice, done with anything, requiring explanation before they would touch it. The adults were managing water collection, fuel rationing, and a dozen small logistical problems that compounded daily. The children were managing their own version of this, the quiet, cumulative loss of everything that felt normal, and they were expressing it clearly at the dinner table. This is the variable almost no food plan accounts for. You can build the most nutritionally complete, carefully sourced pantry imaginable. If the children in your home refuse to eat what is in it, you now have a morale crisis sitting directly on top of a logistical one. And those 2 problems combined are significantly harder to manage than either one alone. Morale affects decision-making. It affects how adults communicate under stress. It affects the psychological stability of the whole household. A table where children are refusing to eat is not just an inconvenience. It is an early warning sign of household cohesion starting to crack. Canned beef ravioli fixed that in a way nothing more nutritionally sophisticated could have. The reason is not about macros, it is about memory and association. A child who has eaten canned ravioli 50 or 100 times before carries a positive emotional imprint of that food. The specific shape of the pasta, the familiar tomato sauce, the smell when it warms. When everything around them is unfamiliar and disrupted, food that looks and tastes exactly the way it always has functions as an anchor to normality. It communicates something no amount of carefully balanced nutrition can, that some things are still the same. In a household where almost nothing feels the same, that signal is worth more than its calorie count. From a practical standpoint, the nutritional profile is genuinely solid. Complete protein from the beef filling covers essential amino acid requirements. Complex carbohydrates from the pasta provide sustained energy rather than a quick spike. The tomato-based sauce delivers meaningful vitamin C, a nutrient that begins quietly depleting faster than most people realize. Once fresh produce disappears from the diet entirely. Vitamin C deficiency does not announce itself loudly. It erodes immune function, wound healing, and energy levels gradually. The tomato sauce helps slow that process at exactly the point when it matters most. Preparation is zero. Open the can, warm it over a burner if fuel allows. Eat it cold if it doesn't. It holds up either way. Shelf life 2 to 5 years, depending on storage conditions. Cost under $2 per can at most grocery stores. The table settled, but week 3 brought something quieter than hunger or morale, and in some ways harder to recognize and fix. Number 6. Powdered sour cream. By week 3, the food was doing its job on paper. Calories were sufficient. The nutritional profile was holding. Nobody was physically declining in any measurable way. And eating had quietly become a form of work. Rice tasted like rice. Beans tasted like beans. Canned soup was salt and warmth, and not much else behind it. Nothing was wrong in any objective sense, but every meal was predictable before the first bite. Every bowl was already known before it was filled. And that predictability, sustained across days then weeks, does something specific to people that cannot be fixed by simply eating more of the same adequate food. There is a name for this in food science and culinary research: flavor fatigue, and it is not a comfort issue. It is a function issue with real downstream consequences. When sensory monotony in the diet persists long enough, appetite regulation actually weakens. The hunger signal becomes easier to override. People begin eating less not because food is scarce, but because the motivation to face another identical meal quietly erodes. According to research on extended food monotony, caloric intake can drop by 15 to 20% or more in some individuals purely due to palatability decline, not shortage. The pantry stays full. The people eating from it gradually consume less of it. Energy drops. Cognitive sharpness follows. 1 tablespoon of powdered sour cream stirred into almost anything reversed that pattern. The chemistry is straightforward and worth understanding. Fat-soluble flavor compounds, the ones responsible for depth, richness, and complexity in food, require either fat or acid to fully activate and carry to the palate. In a long-term dry pantry stretched across weeks, both fat and acid naturally become scarce. Most staples are starchy, neutral, and flat. Powdered sour cream provides both missing elements simultaneously. The lactic acid produced during the original fermentation process survives dehydration and reconstitutes when water is added. That acidity, that brightness and tang, cuts directly through the flat starchy quality that had come to define every single meal. 1 tablespoon into a bowl of rice and beans completely changed the experience of eating that bowl. Not slightly, completely. The same effect worked on canned soup, on mashed potato flakes, on plain crackers used as a base. The food didn't change. What it tasted like, and more importantly, what it felt like to eat it, changed entirely. Beyond flavor, powdered sour cream contributes fat and dairy-derived protein. 2 macronutrients that are genuinely difficult to source adequately in a pantry built primarily around grains and legumes. The body's craving for fat at week 3 is not weakness or preference. It is a physiological signal that the diet is missing something real. Sealed containers carry a shelf life of 1 to 2 years. Cost is typically under $8 per container at outdoor supply or bulk food retailers. Flavor fatigue addressed. But week 4 brought a problem that no amount of smart seasoning could solve. Number 5. Canned pork loin. By week 4, something had built up that nobody had factored in at the start. Water was being hauled by hand 200 meters from a collection point, filtered on site, carried back and stored. Tasks that electricity normally handles invisibly were now taking hours of sustained physical effort every single day. Firewood, manual maintenance, basic systems that normally run invisibly in a powered home were now running entirely on human energy. And that load had been compounding since day one. Here is the gap most emergency food plans never account for. The protein and caloric requirements of sustained manual labor are meaningfully higher than what most preparedness guides assume. The standard model for emergency food quantity is built around sedentary or lightly active conditions. The assumption that people are sheltering in place, conserving energy, staying still. Real extended emergencies do not work that way. Water still has to move. Heat still has to be generated. Problems still have to be physically solved. The body doing that work for hours every day needs more than a body at rest. Significantly more. Legumes are genuinely excellent protein sources under normal or lightly active conditions. But under several hours of daily physical labor, the body begins demanding complete protein with higher bioavailability and dietary fat that provides sustained caloric energy over a full workday. Not the kind of energy that spikes and fades, but the kind that carries consistent output from morning through afternoon. Beans stop being enough, and most pantries are built almost entirely around beans. Canned pork loin, the actual cut of meat, not processed pork, directly address that gap in a way nothing else in the pantry could. The distinction from processed pork products is not cosmetic. Most canned pork items are formed composites. Ground, seasoned, shaped under pressure into a uniform product. Canned pork loin is a real anatomical cut, cooked and sealed in its own natural juices. The protein density is significantly higher per gram than any legume source. The fat content delivers the kind of sustained caloric output that carbohydrate-heavy foods cannot replicate for a body doing hours of physical work. And there is something that matters beyond the numbers. The texture is immediately recognizable. It behaves like meat when you slice it because it is meat. In a context where the psychological dimension of eating had become nearly as important as the nutritional one, that recognition carries genuine weight. Food that looks like what it is provides a sense of adequacy that no amount of calorically equivalent alternatives can fully replace. Pull tab slice. Eat cold or warm depending on available fuel. No soaking time, no simmering, no process between the can and the plate. Shelf life 2 to 5 years. Under $5 per can. Physical capacity held through week 4 and into week 5. Then week 6 brought something that strength and calories alone could not manage. Number 4. Canned beef tamales. When illness moves through a household that is already under sustained stress, the food problem changes shape entirely and faster than you expect. A minor illness swept through in week 6, nothing that would have required a hospital under normal conditions, but enough to take people off their feet for several consecutive days. And here is what that situation revealed. A sick person in week 6 of a grid-down situation does not want food that has been optimized. They do not want something efficient or nutritionally calculated. They want food that feels like it came from a real kitchen. Food that feels like someone thought about them when they made it. That is a specific, concrete requirement, and it is one that almost every standard long-term pantry item fails to meet. Canned beef tamales are one of the very few shelf-stable foods that genuinely don't. The corn masa wrapped around the seasoned beef filling carries a flavor profile that is warm, slightly sweet and savory, in a way that belongs to a specific culinary tradition, a way that tastes intentional, not functional. After weeks of eating from a narrow, rotating set of staples, encountering a flavor that has cultural context, that comes from somewhere real, registers differently in the brain than another bowl of adequately seasoned rice. Research on palatability and recovery nutrition consistently shows that people eat meaningfully more of food they want to eat, and that higher intake during illness directly accelerates recovery by supporting immune response, tissue repair, and sustained energy output. The comfort dimension of food is not separate from its nutritional function. In illness, it is part of the function. There is also a practical dimension worth noting. Sick people in disrupted households often have limited access to hot food. Fuel conservation becomes a real consideration when someone is managing an illness that may last multiple days. Canned beef tamales eat well at room temperature directly from the can without losing their appeal. That is genuinely unusual among shelf-stable foods. Most things that are edible cold are merely tolerable cold. Tamales hold up. The corn masa provides complex carbohydrates. The beef filling delivers protein and fat. Together, the combination is calorie-dense in a way that supports recovery even when appetite has dropped and portion sizes have naturally shrunk. Shelf life, 2 to 3 years, under $3 per can. The illness passed, the household steadied, and then came a week that nobody had thought to identify as a crisis, but absolutely was one. If this is genuinely useful so far, what's the one food on this list you're most surprised you don't already have? Drop it in the comments. Number 3. Dried lupini beans. By week 8, the problem wasn't physical. It wasn't emotional in any obvious or visible way. It was quieter than either of those things, and in some ways more corrosive. The pantry had become completely predictable. Every meal was known before it was made. Every flavor was expected before the first bite landed. Foods that had genuinely felt like comfort back in week 1 had become 8 weeks in something closer to a sentence being served. Nobody was going hungry. No one was nutritionally deficient by any measurable standard. But people were beginning to eat less, not because food was short, but because the will to face another identical meal had started to quietly dissolve. This is a documented pattern in extended food disruption research. When dietary sensory variety disappears for long enough, appetite regulation weakens at a physiological level, not just a preference level. The hunger signal becomes easier to suppress or ignore. According to studies on dietary monotony, individuals in prolonged low-variety food environments show measurable reductions in voluntary caloric intake, even when food is freely available, driven entirely by palatability decline rather than shortage. People skip meals not from lack of hunger, but from the accumulated weight of knowing exactly what eating that meal is going to feel like before they start. That is a nutritional problem wearing a psychological disguise. Lupini beans gave the family something nothing else in the pantry could offer. A food experience that was genuinely completely new at week 8, when new was the one thing most desperately needed. But lupini beans are not simple to prepare, and understanding why that matters is part of what makes them valuable here. Dried lupini beans contain natural alkaloids, bitter compounds produced by the plant as a natural defense that must be removed before they are safe and palatable to eat. The preparation process works like this. Soak the dried beans in fresh water for 24 hours, then transfer them to a brine solution, and change that brine every 12 hours for 3 to 5 full days. It sounds demanding. Under ordinary circumstances, most people would look at that process and decide it is not worth the effort. But in week 8 of a prolonged emergency, the calculation changes completely. Time is no longer scarce. What is scarce is purpose, variety, and the sense that something is happening beyond the daily maintenance cycle of survival. The lupini bean preparation process, counterintuitively, provided exactly that. It became a project, something to check on, something to tend. Something that moved forward across several days and gave the household a small but genuine sense of purposeful activity at a point when purposeful activity had become its own scarce resource. The psychological value of that process turned out to be nearly as significant as the food it produced. What came out of it was unlike anything else in the pantry. Firm texture, almost meaty in the way it resisted the bite. A briny, tangy flavor profile closer to a cured olive or preserved vegetable than to any other legume. No cooking required after the brining process is complete. Eat them at room temperature, straight from the brine, as a standalone food or alongside anything else. Nutritionally, lupini beans are exceptional by legume standards. They contain more protein per gram than lentils, chickpeas, or black beans, placing them among the highest protein plant foods available. They are high in dietary fiber and relatively low in net carbohydrates, making them genuinely distinct from the grain and legume base that had dominated this family's diet for 2 full months. That nutritional distinctiveness, combined with the completely different sensory profile, made them feel like a reset, stored, dry and sealed, 25 to 30-year shelf life, under $3 per pound. A new flavor at week 8 changed the experience of every meal that followed it. But by week 10, novelty had given way to something heavier. Number 2. Freeze-dried ground beef. Week 10 has a specific quality that is almost impossible to fully understand from the outside. The acute sharp stress of the early weeks had faded. The physical routine had long since become automatic. What replaced both of those things was something deeper and harder to name. A structural exhaustion that adequate sleep does not fix, because sleep is not what caused it. It came from 10 consecutive weeks of applying conscious effort to things that normally require none. 10 weeks of making decisions about systems that normally make themselves. The quiet, relentless accumulation of management applied to everything all day, with no clear end visible and no natural recovery point. At that stage, the capacity to manage any food preparation process that demands more than minimal effort had been genuinely spent. Not depleted for the day, spent. There is a difference between being tired and being at the bottom of a resource that refills slowly. Week 10 was the latter. Asking someone at that point to soak beans overnight, manage a 40-minute simmer, or combine multiple preparation steps into a single meal is not a reasonable request. The will simply is not there, and that is not a character failure. It is what happens when a finite reserve has been drawn on continuously for 10 weeks without adequate replenishment. Freeze-dried ground beef exists to solve exactly this problem, and it does so more completely than any other shelf-stable protein source. The product is real ground beef, cooked fully, then processed through freeze-drying, which removes moisture while preserving the complete cellular structure of the meat. This is what distinguishes freeze-drying from conventional dehydration. Dehydration applies heat, which can alter texture and nutrient profile. Freeze-drying removes moisture through sublimation, converting ice directly to vapor under low pressure, which leaves the protein structure, fat content, and flavor profile almost entirely intact. The result rehydrates in approximately 10 minutes with hot water and returns to a texture and flavor closely resembling freshly cooked ground beef. Add hot water, wait 10 minutes, stir into rice, into beans, into whatever tomato sauce remained in the pantry. It adds complete protein, dietary fat, and real substance to any base, without browning, without draining, without timing or technique. The decision required is minimal. The result is a meal with actual protein density that tastes like something real. Some commercially available versions are pre-seasoned, which removes one more decision from a household that had already exhausted its daily decision-making capacity long before dinner. A single pouch typically serves 6 to 8 people. Shelf life 25 years under proper storage conditions. Cost under $20 per pouch, under $3 per serving when divided across the household. The energy that would have gone into sourcing and preparing that protein went toward everything else the household still needed to manage at week 10. That was not a convenience. It was the difference between a household maintaining function and one quietly beginning to unravel. The final weeks were navigated, but week 12, the last stretch, needed something that none of the 7 foods before it could provide. Number 1. Canned chicken a la king. There is a category of food that functions differently from everything else on this list. Not because of its protein content, not because of how quickly it prepares, but because of what it actually communicates to the person eating it, to the family gathered at the same table, to the part of the mind that has been quietly and continuously tracking for 12 weeks whether things are trending toward better or toward worse. That tracking is real. It happens below the level of conscious thought, and it responds to signals that have nothing to do with calorie counts. By week 12, this family had been eating from their emergency pantry for 83 consecutive days. The children were carrying a kind of tiredness that went beyond any single hard day. The accumulated weight of 12 weeks of disruption, of missing things, of adapting continuously without a break. The adults were carrying the same thing in a different form. The physical demands had not decreased. The psychological weight of the situation had not lifted. And somewhere in the back of a shelf, moved quietly from one side to the other, but never opened, was a can that had been there since week 1. Nobody talked about it. Nobody made a deliberate decision to save it, but it was never opened. Canned chicken a la king is chicken pieces in a creamy sauce with vegetables, peas, peppers, sometimes mushrooms, fully cooked, fully combined, sealed in the can at the point of completion. Nothing needs to be added to it. Nothing needs to be done to it. It is structurally and practically a complete meal in a single can. But what makes it different from every other item on this list is the cream sauce. And this distinction is more significant than it sounds. For 3 months, the fat in this family's diet had come from cooking oil, from the canned pork loin, from the freeze-dried beef. All of those sources provided dietary fat. None of them delivered what a cream-based sauce delivers. That enveloping coating richness that the body and brain register as deeply nourishing in a way other fat sources don't fully replicate. There is a specific sensory experience created by an emulsified cream sauce. The way it coats the palate, the way it carries flavor throughout the entire mouth rather than concentrating it at a single point. That is distinct from oil, from meat fat, from any other fat source in a standard emergency pantry. For 90 days, that specific experience had been completely absent. The body notices that absence even when the mind doesn't consciously register it. Eaten cold, directly from the can, it works. Warmed over a single camp burner, it tastes like food prepared in a kitchen that still has electricity. That gap between food that functions and food that feels like a meal from a real home is the entire reason this item closes the list. On day 89 of 90, the father took the can from the shelf. He opened it without ceremony. He warmed it on the small burner they had been using for 3 months. He sat down and ate it quietly, and then he cried. Not from sadness, not exactly from relief, but because the taste of it told him something that 88 days of adequate, sufficient, carefully managed food had not been able to communicate that the worst was behind them, that the end was within reach, that they had made it. Shelf life, 2 to 3 years under $4 per can. What this list is actually teaching you, the real lesson here, is not about these specific 8 foods. It is about how a prolonged emergency keeps changing what it demands, week by week, problem by problem, in ways that no plan made from the outside fully anticipates. Week 1 needs texture and color and the energy to cook. Week 2 needs something familiar enough that children will actually eat it. Week 3 needs flavor variety before psychological decline starts reducing how much people consume. Week 4 needs caloric density that matches what the body is actually being asked to do. Week 6 needs comfort that feels human. Week 8 needs genuine novelty. Week 10 needs effortlessness. And Week 12 needs something that functions as a signal, not just as fuel. No single food covers all of that. What a real emergency pantry needs is depth across all of those dimensions: calories, protein, comfort, sensory range, emotional weight, and varying levels of preparation demand. Most pantries have 1 or 2 of those, almost none have all of them. The family behind this list did not plan it as a system. They discovered each item's value at the exact moment the need for it arrived. Under $400 90 days, one family that made it through, and a set of lessons that cost them everything to learn. You do not have to learn it that way. What is the one item from this list you are going to add to your pantry first? Drop it below. I read every one. The logistical failure of civilian food infrastructure during prolonged disruptions is not an act of God. It is a mathematical certainty built into the modern supply chain. To understand why a standard pantry collapses by week 8, we have to look at the structural vulnerabilities of what logistics experts call the just-in-time inventory system. This economic framework, pioneered by manufacturing sectors in the late 20th century and aggressively adopted by major grocery conglomerates in the 1990s, operates on a razor-thin margin. The average metropolitan supermarket carries exactly 3 days of food supply under normal consumer purchasing behavior. When an anomaly occurs, whether it is a regional grid failure, a multi-state infrastructure collapse, or a supply chain bottleneck, that 3-day buffer vaporizes in less than 6 hours. The resulting vacuum forces citizens to rely entirely on domestic storage, exposing a severe geographic and structural trap that has been decades in the making. The historical roots of this geographic trap trace back to municipal zoning laws passed between 1970 and 1990. During this period, urban planning shifted heavily towards centralization. Small, localized food processing plants, independent cold storage facilities, and neighborhood distribution hubs were systematically phased out in favor of massive, regional distribution complexes located near major interstate junctions. In the United States, for instance, a significant portion of shelf-stable goods relies on cross-docking facilities concentrated in specific logistics corridors like the Inland Empire in California, northern Texas, or central Pennsylvania. This geographic concentration means that an event disabling a single transportation artery or regional power grid effectively isolates surrounding populations from 90% of their caloric inputs. The modern civilian is not just geographically separated from the source of their food. They are separated from the mechanism that moves it. This brings us to the core structural flaw of the typical civilian emergency pantry. When consumers attempt to mitigate this vulnerability by purchasing bulk survival rations, they operate under data provided by marketing campaigns rather than historical precedent. The standard emergency food kit market, valued at over $500 million globally, operates on a major physiological oversight, the flat caloric baseline. Most commercially available long-term food buckets are sold under the metric of total calories, often advertising 25-year shelf lives and 30 days of complete nutrition. However, an analysis of the itemized contents reveals that up to 40% of those advertised calories are derived from simple carbohydrates, refined sugars, and beverage thickeners. They are designed for a sedentary survival model, a scenario where an individual remains in a climate-controlled room with zero physical output. Historical data from actual prolonged grid-down scenarios completely refutes this sedentary model. During the 1990s geopolitical conflicts in the Balkans, specifically the 3-year siege of Sarajevo, civilian energy expenditure rose by an estimated 150%. Every daily necessity required intense manual input. Water had to be carried manually from central distribution points over broken terrain. Municipal waste management ceased to function, requiring hand-dug sanitation trenches. Climate control failed, forcing citizens to manually process wood, debris, and furniture for thermal regulation. Under these conditions, a diet built on starchy carbohydrates and low bioavailability plant proteins results in a rapid metabolic deficit. The body begins breaking down its own muscle tissue to fulfill its amino acid requirements, leading to lethargy, cognitive decline, and an impaired immune system within 21 days. Furthermore, the domestic storage environment itself is a major point of failure that few consumers properly analyze. Standard residential architecture built after World War II lacks the thermal insulation properties of traditional subterranean root cellars. Modern homes are built as active systems that require continuous electrical inputs to maintain stable internal temperatures and humidity levels. When the grid drops for an extended duration, the interior of a standard residential home fluctuates radically according to external weather patterns. In summer conditions, attic spaces and upper floor closets frequently exceed 40 degrees Celsius. According to food science data from the United States Department of Agriculture, every 10 degrees Celsius increase above optimal storage temperature cuts the actual shelf life of canned goods and dry grains by half. Hydrolytic rancidity accelerates in stored fats, and the organic liners of commercial tin cans degrade faster, leaching metallic compounds into the food and neutralizing critical micronutrients like vitamin C and thiamine. The financial incentive structure of corporate food production also actively works against long-term domestic security. Large-scale agricultural producers optimize crops for yield, visual uniformity, and immediate processing efficiency, rather than micronutrient density. White rice, which forms the foundation of 95% of civilian survival stockpiles, is a stark example of this optimization paradox. To make rice shelf-stable for decades, industrial processes strip away the husk, the bran, and the germ. This process successfully removes the volatile oils that would otherwise cause the grain to go rancid within a year, but it also removes over 80% of the grain's natural thiamine, niacin, and iron. What remains is pure starch. If a household relies on this base without precise, high bioavailability interventions, they are not setting themselves up for survival. They are setting themselves up for high-calorie starvation. The history of disaster management shows that the households that fractured first were not those that ran out of total mass, but those whose stored mass failed to adapt to the shifting metabolic and psychological realities of a multi-week emergency. The operational reality of a long-term grid failure or supply chain collapse reveals an immediate violent friction between institutional disaster response protocols and regional survival realities. When standard distribution networks fracture, the immediate reaction of both municipal authorities and corporate entities is protectionism. During the major infrastructure disruptions of the early 2020s, including the physical destruction of primary logistics hubs near Kyiv in March 22 and the multi-state agricultural supply shocks driven by regional climate extremes. The primary point of failure was not a lack of raw food commodities. The failure point was the immediate total freezing of commercial distribution channels. In an emergency scenario that crosses the 30-day threshold, large retail conglomerates systematically redirect remaining green inventories away from standard commercial stores to supply centralized, state-controlled distribution centers. This institutional hoarding creates artificial deserts in suburban and rural zones within 72 hours of an emergency declaration. This structural redirection exhibits the hidden mechanism of food weaponization and asset seizure during a prolonged crisis. Under emergency legislation such as the Defense Production Act in the United States or equivalent statutory frameworks in the European Union, federal authorities possess the legal right to seize, ration, and redistribute private commercial inventories, fuel reserves, and agricultural outputs. Consequently, the localized grain elevators, cold storage facilities, and corporate warehouses that civilians assume will eventually leak supplies into the local economy are placed under immediate military or federal guard. Independent truck drivers and private logistics operators face strict fuel rationing and mandatory route directives. This statutory framework effectively criminalizes independent, local food distribution, forcing small-scale producers into a catastrophic choice: comply with federal seizure orders or risk immediate asset confiscation and criminal prosecution. The resulting clash between centralized policy and local survival causes a rapid systemic breakdown at the farm level. During the 22 power infrastructure collapses in Eastern Europe, livestock and dairy sectors experienced a total collapse of cold chain logistics. Industrial dairy farms, which require continuous electrical power for mechanized milking systems and bulk refrigeration units, were forced to dump hundreds of thousands of liters of raw milk directly into waste trenches because corporate processing plants were offline or inaccessible due to fuel shortages and blocked transport corridors. Concurrently, massive poultry facilities suffered catastrophic operational failure within 48 hours of backup generator fuel depletion, resulting in the immediate loss of millions of primary protein sources. While urban populations faced severe caloric deficits, rural producers were buried under rotting, undistributable agricultural mass. The modern agricultural system is so deeply specialized that a farm producing 10 tons of raw protein per week cannot package, process, or distribute that protein to the immediate local population without corporate processing infrastructure. This brings the civilian domestic pantry into a dangerous operational bottleneck by week 8. As municipal water systems, sanitation infrastructure, and waste management services remain offline, the domestic home transitions from a shelter into a localized biohazard zone. The accumulation of organic waste, coupled with the inability to maintain internal climate control, creates an optimal environment for pest infestations and rapid bacterial growth. Households that stockpiled large volumes of grains and legumes without professional-grade rodent protection or industrial-grade chemical sealants discover that their primary caloric reserves are actively targeted by external vectors. Weevils, flower beetles, and common rodents breach standard plastic storage bins and standard cardboard packaging within 30 days of a localized infrastructure collapse. Once a bulk dry supply is breached by pests, the introduction of moisture and metabolic waste triggers rapid mold proliferation, specifically Aspergillus flavus, which produces highly toxic carcinogenic aflatoxins. Consuming contaminated grain causes acute liver damage, immunosuppression, and severe gastrointestinal illness, rendering the entire food reserve completely useless at the exact moment medical infrastructure is non-existent. Simultaneously, an internal psychological and physiological crisis reaches a critical dead end inside the household. By the